Hello everyone, I have received multiple phone calls from brokers, my own team members, members of the community, and definitely clients asking me about the future of real estate, specifically how real estate commissions are going to be paid out by the buyer, by the seller, split. Before I give you an answer, I would like to show you how business is currently being conducted and how this change that's coming due to that NAR class action lawsuit settlement will barely affect the business. So let's pick an average price point of $400,000, which is very typical for a two-bed, two-bath in the city of Chicago. We have a buyer who typically puts 10 or 20% down payment. They also have closing costs, which are about 3% or $12,000. And of course, the remaining $360,000 are borrowed from a bank. So that would be 90% of the purchase price, $360,000. So now the buyer would have their own money towards the down payment, the bank's money, $360,000 combined, that's $400,000. They would also have to spend about 3% or $12,000 in closing costs. What's the closing costs? Their transfer stamps, transfer taxes, attorney fees, title charges, etc. The closing usually happens at a title company, and all this money, the $52,000 from the buyer, goes to the title company, and the $360,000 from the bank goes to the title company. Clearly, the title company will keep, give or take, about $12,000 in closing costs to redistribute them to the state, county, etc. And of course, the $400,000 has to be distributed towards the seller, the seller's bank or mortgage. It needs to be paid off before the title transfers. And of course, up until this point, let's use an example of 5% real estate commission is paid from the title company to the buyer's brokerage firm and seller's brokerage firm. It's usually split 2.5% and 2.5%. And of course, the brokerage companies would pay the actual buyer's broker and seller's broker. And let's suppose that the seller has a $250,000 mortgage to pay off. And also the seller has closing costs of about 3% or $12,000. So now the title company will take the mortgage or the borrowed money, will take the down payment and the closing costs from the borrower, cash buyer. They will redistribute it between those, and whatever is left is going to go to the seller. Now, if you do the math, they'll pay off the mortgage of $250,000. 2.5% and 2.5% is $10,000 and $10,000. So that's $270,000, and then another $12,000 that has to be paid by the seller. The seller is going to be left with $118,000 to collect. Now, the argument that has been made in court and the common misconception is that the seller pays both brokers, the buyer, the buyer's broker, and the listing broker. Now, let's look at the flow of money. The buyer takes the money, their own money, and the bank's money, transfers it to the title company, and the title company distributes it. Whether it goes directly from the title company to the buyer's broker, or goes to the seller and then goes to their broker and goes to this broker, where did the $10,000 commission come from? The buyer. So ultimately, the buyer is the one who has been paying his own broker. It's just going through the title company, in some cases going through the seller's broker, and goes to the buyer's broker. So the argument that has been made is, well, how about if some sellers say, we don't want that flow, we don't want to pay that commission this way, we'd like to have the buyer pay their own broker directly. So this shifts here, which is 2.5% or $10,000. It's $10,000. So here is and obviously this does not exist. So then the seller can afford to sell this for $10,000 less. So the net price effect for the seller is the same. Instead of $400, now they'll end up collecting $390, and the net price for the buyer is the same. Here is the difference. If this buyer has been working their tushy off to save this money, they don't have another $10,000. How are they going to come up on top of the $52,000 with another $10,000? If they don't have it, they can't buy that property. So a seller who is not willing to offer to cover the buyer's broker's commission, he will not be able to sell it to a buyer who doesn't have the ability to come up with additional $10,000. So specifically, I have already had this discussion with a few sellers. And the question has been, well, can I skip paying the buyer's broker's commission? Therefore, I can afford to sell the property for less. It's the same net effect to you. But the buyer who does not have the additional liquidity, dash money, to come up with this amount, they cannot buy your property unless you do this. So up until this point, I'll repeat it. It has been a common misconception that the seller pays the buyer's broker's commission. No, the money comes from the buyer. The buyer transfers it to the title company. In some cases, it gets to the seller before it gets to the buyer's broker. Shifting the funds could be very easy for high net worth individuals who have the cash, and 10,000 more or less, it won't make a difference. But unfortunately, being part of the 99%, I know that people need to borrow. And if they don't have the liquidity, they will not be able to purchase the property that does not offer buyer's broker's cooperative commission. The only thing, in my opinion, that's going to change is there will be an additional disclosure asking the seller to agree and consent, pay their broker directly without having to go through the title company or the seller. That's the only thing that's going to change, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, it's still the same money and still the same net effect for 99% of the transactions.